All right, so we are diving into the Eisenhower years today,
Okay.
and it's going to be a deep dive. It's
Yeah.
not just like, skimming through a textbook or anything.
Right.
You gave me some really interesting stuff, though.
Oh, good.
Some learning objectives from a history course
Mm.
and some slides that were really interesting.
Yeah.
And I feel like we've got a really good roadmap to uncover some stuff about Eisenhower that maybe people don't know.
Yeah. I think there's a lot there.
And maybe we could shift your perspective a little bit about this era.
I hope so.
It's more than just I like Ike
Right.
and the
Yeah.
interstate system,
Of course. Yeah. Those are important pieces.
although those are big.
For sure.
But there's a lot more going on.
It's interesting, isn't it, how a presidency can be kind of quiet
Yeah.
on the surface, but have such a deep impact?
Yeah.
I mean, Eisenhower really did
Mhm.
affect American society
Totally.
in a subtle but profound way.
So before we go too deep into all of that, let's just sort of set the stage a little bit.
Right.
Eisenhower, our 34th president,
Yes.
served from 1953 to 1961.
That's right.
And he did some pretty big things,
Oh, yeah.
pretty notable things right away,
Right off the bat.
ending the Korean War, which everybody wanted.
Huge. Yeah.
But it's interesting because he ended that war,
Yeah.
which the country desperately wanted,
Yeah.
but he kept the pressure on the Soviet Union.
Exactly. And that's where I think you start to see his approach.
Yeah.
He's not going to back down,
Yeah,
but he's also not looking for unnecessary conflict.
right.
It sets the tone for his whole presidency,
Yeah,
kind of a calm but firm hand on the wheel.
right. And then there's this stuff that's almost impossible to miss in
Yeah.
our daily lives, like the interstate highway system.
Oh my gosh. It's
Totally changed how we travel, how we live.
completely.
And the establishment of NASA,
Right.
which launched us into the space race.
Absolutely. We'll talk about
And we'll get into all that.
the long-term consequences of that for sure,
Yeah.
both good and bad.
Yeah, definitely.
But we also can't forget about the domestic programs that he championed,
Yeah,
expanding Social Security,
Right.
increasing the minimum wage,
yeah.
and then, of course, the landmark Brown v. Board of Education ruling.
You still do.
These are all signs of a presidency that was very focused on shaping the social fabric of the nation.
Okay, so speaking of impact,
Okay.
we have to talk about I Like Ike.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that
They're
slogan,
everywhere.
it was everywhere. Songs, buttons, posters.
It was a phenomenon.
Yeah, it wasn't just a campaign. It was like a cultural phenomenon.
It really was.
So why did that resonate so much with voters?
That's a good question.
I mean, we were just getting out of World War II.
Yeah.
The Cold War was ramping up.
Mm-hmm.
What was it about Ike that really captured the public imagination?
I think it was more than just a catchy phrase.
Okay.
It really tapped into this deep yearning that I think
Fair.
a lot of Americans had for stability and a return to normalcy.
Yeah.
People were tired after World War II.
Yeah.
They were tired of conflict.
Right.
They were tired of uncertainty.
And they wanted somebody they could trust.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Eisenhower, this war hero,
Right.
with this reassuring demeanor,
Yes.
he just seemed like the steady hand that the
Okay.
country needed. And
Yeah.
like Ike, it wasn't about
Yeah.
complex policy promises or anything like that.
Right. It was about feeling.
It was about trust
Yeah.
and I think a sense of optimism.
So it was like more about the feeling he projected
I think so.
than any specific policy.
Yeah.
It's like maybe people were looking for a leader they
Mhm.
felt like they could personally connect with.
Yeah,
Almost like a friend or a favorite uncle.
exactly. And I think that desire for a relatable leader
Yeah.
really played directly into his governing style,
Okay.
which is his famous hidden hand approach.
Yeah, so let's dig into that. What did this hidden hand presidency actually look like
Yeah.
in practice? Because we've got this incredibly popular president,
Right.
but he's not out there like giving fiery speeches all the time or micromanaging every decision.
It's almost a paradox.
Yeah.
He was this powerful presence, but he often worked behind the scenes.
Okay.
He was known for delegating authority to his
that-
cabinet.
Yeah.
He let them run their departments with a lot of autonomy.
Right.
He set the goals, the broad vision,
Okay.
but he wasn't really in the weeds of everyday operations.
So he was kind of like a CEO.
Yeah.
Setting the direction for the company
Mhm.
and letting the experts in each department figure out the
Thank-
details.
That's a great analogy.
Okay.
And this approach had its advantages.
Okay.
It projected that sense of calm,
Right.
steady leadership
Which people wanted.
that the country seemed to be craving.
Right.
But it also had its downsides.
Yeah.
Some people argued that it created a lack of transparency.
Okay.
Was he really in control?
Yeah.
Or were other forces shaping policy behind closed doors?
It makes you wonder.
It does.
Did this hidden hand style, the same style that made him so popular, also make it harder to hold him accountable for specific decisions?
For sure.
It's like you like the guy, but you're not always sure what he's doing or why.
It's a fascinating dynamic.
It is.
But to really understand its impact, we need to look at the actual policies that came out of his administration.
Let's do it.
And there's no better place to start than with his most ambitious project, the interstate highway system.
Oh, yeah, the project that quite literally reshaped America.
Reshaped America, yeah.
This is the largest public works project in U.S. history.
The biggest one ever.
It's hard to imagine what our country would look like without those massive freeways crisscrossing the nation.
It wasn't just about building roads, though.
Right.
It was about connecting communities, boosting commerce, and, in a way, redefining what it meant to be an American.
Right.
I mean, the impact on the economy was immense.
Yeah.
Businesses could transport goods more efficiently.
Yeah.
And then the rise of suburbs accelerated because people could commute longer distances.
And it wasn't just economic.
No, not at all.
Right. I mean, the interstate system had a huge cultural impact, too.
Oh, yeah.
Suddenly, road trips became like this national pastime.
Exactly.
Fast food chains sprang up along the highways.
Everywhere.
And this whole idea of American mobility and freedom really took on a whole new dimension.
Absolutely. It created the sense of interconnectedness.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, it expanded their horizons in ways they never could have imagined.
But I imagine there were some downsides, too.
There were some unintended consequences, for sure.
Okay, like
Well, you think about the decline of urban centers, the rise of car dependency, even maybe the homogenization of American culture.
Right.
These are all things that you can trace back to.
Wow.
Those massive highways.
So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
This incredible achievement also brought challenges.
Absolutely.
That we're still dealing with.
We are to this day. It's a reminder that progress often comes with a price.
Yeah.
And it's a perfect example of how a single policy, even one with good intentions, can have these ripple effects far beyond what anyone could have predicted.
And while all this was going on, Eisenhower was also taking steps to expand the social safety net.
Yeah.
Right. He added 10 million more people to Social Security.
That you did.
And he raised the minimum wage to $1 an hour.
A big deal back then.
Which was a big deal back then.
It was.
So these actions, along with the Housing Act of 1954, which provided federal funds for urban renewal and public housing.
Right. Reflect this presidency concerned with the well-being of everyday Americans.
Absolutely. It's a side of Eisenhower that often gets overshadowed by the Cold War narrative.
It makes you think about his relationship with the New Deal programs.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, he worked under FDR and even helped launch some of those initiatives.
He did.
So did he see himself as continuing that legacy?
That's a complex question.
Okay.
I think he generally accepted New Deal reforms.
Okay.
He wasn't looking to dismantle them.
Okay.
But he also believed in a balanced budget.
Okay.
Which really became a defining characteristic of his economic philosophy.
Right.
His focus was more on fiscal responsibility and targeted investments, like infrastructure, rather than these large-scale social programs.
So was he trying to find a middle ground between traditional Republican views and the legacy of the New Deal?
I think so. He was a pragmatist.
Trying to find that balance between these competing ideologies and the needs of a changing nation.
Right. And this pragmatic approach is also evident.
It is.
In some of his lesser-known domestic policies, like agricultural price supports and the Bricker Amendment.
Right.
Now, those are two things I don't know much about.
Okay, well, let's unpack them.
Okay.
What were agricultural price supports and why were they controversial?
Yeah.
Well, the idea was to help farmers by having the government buy surplus crops at a guaranteed price.
Right.
This was meant to stabilize farm income and protect farmers from market fluctuations.
Okay, so it sounds good on paper.
Right. It sounds
like it's a way to ensure that farmers could make a decent living.
Exactly. But it wasn't that simple.
Okay. What happened?
Well, it often led to overproduction, which meant the government was buying tons of crops that ended up going to waste.
Oh, wow.
It also became very expensive, and critics argued that it mostly benefited large agribusinesses rather than the small family farms.
Right.
It was supposed to help.
So good intentions, but some unintended consequences.
Classic case, yeah.
Okay, so what about the Bricker Amendment?
Right, the Bricker Amendment.
That one sounds pretty obscure.
This was an attempt to limit the president's treaty-making powers.
Okay.
Conservatives were worried that international agreements could override domestic law.
Okay.
And they wanted to make sure the president couldn't essentially make law through treaties.
Okay.
It caused a huge debate.
Yeah.
But ultimately it failed to pass Congress.
So we've got the interstate system, social programs, agriculture, treaty power.
It's a lot.
It's a lot to juggle.
It is.
It seems like domestic policy kept him pretty busy.
Yeah, he had his hands full.
But of course,
his
presidency was also deeply intertwined with the Cold War. And that's where his New Look policy comes in.
Right.
This idea of relying heavily on nuclear weapons as a deterrent.
As a deterrent.
Yeah. So the New Look was...
There was a major shift in military strategy.
Okay.
It was based on this idea that a strong nuclear arsenal would prevent the Soviets from even considering an attack.
Okay, so it seems almost counterintuitive.
It does.
Like you build up all these weapons of mass destruction with the hope that you'll never have to use them.
Hoping you never have to use them, exactly.
Yeah, so was the public aware?
That's a good question.
Of just how much emphasis was being put on nuclear weapons?
I think there was some public anxiety about nuclear war.
Sure.
But I don't think the full extent of the New Look and its implications were widely known.
Okay.
And this secrecy, of course, fed into those criticisms of Eisenhower's hidden hand approach.
Yeah.
People weren't always sure what was going on behind the scenes.
It's scary.
Yeah, and it created a sense of unease for some.
Okay, so we've got this massive buildup of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And then there's the massive retaliation doctrine.
Oh, yeah.
Which I have to admit sounds terrifying.
It does sound a little scary.
Basically, the idea is that any aggression from the Soviets, no matter how small, would be met with overwhelming nuclear force.
That's essentially it, yeah.
Yeah, so it was bold.
But it was very bold.
Maybe reckless.
Some might say reckless, yeah.
Designed to deter any Soviet action.
That's the idea.
Whether it was conventional or nuclear.
Right.
But it also raises some serious ethical and strategic questions.
Oh, huge ethical questions.
Like, what if there was a miscalculation?
Right. What if they call our bluff?
Yeah, the stakes seem incredibly high.
They were very high.
It makes you wonder if this policy actually made the world more dangerous.
It's a debate.
Even if it was intended to prevent war.
A debate that continues to this day.
Yeah, so to understand the full scope of his approach to the Cold War, we also need to look at his use of covert operations.
Yes.
So the CIA interventions in places like Iran and Guatemala.
Right.
This seems like the hidden hand at its most hidden.
This is the hidden hand in the shadows.
Yeah. Why did he choose this route?
Good question.
Was it a way to avoid direct military confrontations?
Partly.
Or was there something else at play?
It was partly about avoiding large-scale military involvement, which he saw as very costly and potentially disastrous in the nuclear age.
But it was also
about maintaining American influence in these strategically important regions, often to prevent the spread of communism.
So you've got these covert operations happening, but at the same time, he's publicly advocating for peace and diplomacy?
Right.
It seems like there's a real tension there.
There is tension for sure.
Between his public persona and the actions being taken behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
Did the American people see through this?
I think there was a growing awareness that things weren't always as they seemed.
Yeah.
That there was more going on beneath the surface. Yeah. But you have to remember the Cold War really created this climate of fear and uncertainty, which made it easier for the government to justify secrecy in the name of national security.
Right. So it's a complicated picture for sure.
It's complicated.
And then there's the U-2 spy plane program.
Oh, yeah.
Which seems straight out of a spy novel.
It does.
These high-altitude flights over Soviet territory, gathering intelligence.
Super risky.
It sounds so risky.
It was cutting-edge technology at the time, and it provided valuable information about Soviet military capabilities.
Okay.
But it was also a major provocation.
Right.
And when a U-2 plane was shot down,
over Soviet territory in 1960.
Right.
It created this huge international incident.
Wow.
I mean, it nearly derailed a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev.
Wow. So high stakes.
Super high stakes.
Yeah. It seems like the Cold War was this constant game of chess with each move carrying enormous risks.
Every move mattered,
And it's all happening against this backdrop of the domino theory.
Yeah, the domino theory.
The idea that if one country fell to communism, others would follow.
That was the thinking.
So that was really a driving force behind much of U.S. foreign policy.
It was.
It drove a lot of interventions in Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere.
So this worldview that saw the Cold War as this global struggle.
A global ideological struggle.
Of ideological dominance.
That's right.
With every country, a potential battleground.
Potentially, yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to Korea for a moment.
Okay.
We know that Eisenhower ended the Korean War.
Right. Which was a major accomplishment.
It was.
But it sounds like things were far from settled.
Far from settled.
Was there really peace?
Well,
or was it just a pause in the fighting?
The Korean War armistice was signed in July of '53.
Okay.
And it did stop the fighting.
Okay.
But there was never a formal peace treaty.
Really?
North and South Korea are technically still at war today.
I did not realize that.
Separated by a heavily fortified, demilitarized zone.
So this war has been going on for over 70 years.
Over 70 years.
Even though there's been no active fighting.
Right. It's like a frozen conflict.
Wow.
A constant reminder of the tensions that still exist.
And tragically, over 36,000 American soldiers.
A lot of lives lost.
Lost their lives in that war.
Yes.
A heavy price to pay for a conflict that never truly ended. So did he accomplish what he set out to do in Korea?
That's a tough question. I mean, he achieved his immediate goal of ending the fight, but the long-term consequences are still debated today.
Right.
Did the war prevent the spread of communism in Asia?
Yeah.
Or did it just create a new flashpoint for future conflict?
It's a lot to ponder.
It is.
And while all this was going on, this whole other dynamic was emerging on the world stage.
Yeah.
The rise of what was then called the Third World.
The Third World.
And I'm curious about this term.
Yeah.
It's not really used anymore.
Not really.
And it seems like it could be easily misinterpreted.
It can be.
So where did that term come from?
Well, the term Third World originated during the Cold War to describe countries that were not aligned with either the U.S. or the Soviet Union.
So they weren't picking a side.
They were not picking a side.
Okay.
They were often newly independent nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
Okay.
And they represented a new challenge for U.S. foreign policy. So it's not just about communism versus democracy anymore.
It's more complicated than that. You've got this whole other group of countries that are saying, hey, we're not picking sides.
We're going to do our own thing.
We've got our own problems.
Yeah.
Our own path to forge.
It must have been frustrating for Eisenhower.
Oh, I'm sure it was.
Who really saw the world through this very Cold War lens.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how did he adapt?
Well,
did he try to force these countries to choose a side?
I think he tried a little bit of both.
Okay.
He continued to use covert operations to try to influence governments and prevent communist takeovers.
Okay.
But he also recognized the need for a more nuanced approach.
Okay, so what did that look like?
Well, he increased foreign aid.
Okay.
Hoping to win over these countries through economic development and support for their independence movements.
But wasn't that kind of a risky strategy?
It was risky.
Because I mean, wasn't there a danger of getting entangled in complex local conflicts or propping up corrupt regimes just because they were anti-communist?
That's right.
So how effective was this strategy?
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
It's a mixed bag.
Okay.
In some cases, foreign aid did help stabilize countries and prevent them from falling under Soviet influence.
Okay.
But in other cases, it really backfired.
Okay, how so?
Well, the U.S. often supported regimes that were corrupt and authoritarian simply because they were anti-communist.
Wow.
And this created resentment. It fueled instability and in some cases laid the groundwork for future conflicts.
So even the best intentions can have unintended consequences.
They can.
Especially in a world as complex as the Cold War.
Absolutely.
And speaking of unintended consequences, let's talk about the Suez Crisis.
Okay, the Suez Crisis.
This event really shook up the global landscape.
It did.
And I think it forced Eisenhower to rethink his approach to the Middle East.
The Suez Crisis was a pivotal moment in Eisenhower's presidency. It really demonstrated the limits of U.S. power and the complexities of navigating these Cold War alliances.
Okay, so remind us what happened.
All right, so just to quickly recap, in 1956, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, which was this vital waterway for international trade. Britain, France, and Israel, fearing Egypt's growing ties to the Soviet Union, launched a military intervention to seize control of the canal.
So you've got these Western powers, traditional allies of the U.S., taking military action against a country that's just trying to assert its own sovereignty.
It's a mess.
Yeah, it's a tangled web.
It is.
How did Eisenhower respond to this?
Well, he was furious.
Really?
He felt betrayed by his allies for not consulting him beforehand.
And he worried that their actions would push Egypt further into the Soviet camp.
So what did he do?
He did something pretty unexpected.
He
condemned the invasion and pressured Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw their forces.
That's a bold move.
It is.
Especially considering the Cold War context. It seems like he's putting principle above realpolitik. Why was he so adamant?
I think he saw it as a matter of principle, but also as a strategic necessity. He believed that the U.S. had to stand up for the sovereignty of nations, even if it meant going against its own allies.
Wow.
And he understood that supporting the invasion would alienate countries across the Middle East and really undermine U.S. interests in the region.
So he was thinking about the long game.
Yeah, the bigger picture.
Yeah.
He wasn't just reacting to the immediate crisis.
It shows real strategic thinking.
It does.
That I think is often missing in foreign policy.
Yeah. Totally. And this event led directly to the creation of the Eisenhower Doctrine.
It did.
Which basically formalized U.S. commitment to containing Soviet influence in the Middle East.
In the Middle East.
So we touched on this earlier.
We did. Host. So last time we were talking about the Third World. And it's a term that's not really used anymore. But it highlights, I think, this really important shift that was happening during Eisenhower's presidency. These newly independent nations, many of them in Africa and Asia, they weren't interested in picking a side in the Cold War.
Yeah, it was almost like they were looking at the U.S. and the Soviet Union saying, like, we've got our own problems to deal with. We're going to forge our own path.
They didn't want to be pawns in this larger ideological struggle.
And that must have been frustrating for Eisenhower.
Oh, I'm sure it was.
Who saw the world through this very Cold War lens.
Absolutely. He believed in the domino theory. If one country fell to communism, others would follow.
And these third world nations weren't buying it.
Nope. They wanted autonomy. And they resented being seen as pawns in this larger ideological struggle.
So how did he adapt?
It's a good question.
Did he try to force these countries to choose a side?
I think he tried a bit of both.
Okay.
He continued to use covert operations to try to influence governments and prevent communist takeovers.
Right.
But he also recognized that he needed a more nuanced approach.
So what did that look like?
Well, he increased foreign aid.
Okay.
Hoping to win over these countries.
Okay.
Through economic development.
Okay.
And support for their independence movements.
But it seems like such a tricky balancing act.
It was very tricky.
Trying to promote democracy.
Right.
While also propping up regimes that were often far from democratic.
That's the dilemma.
How effective was that strategy?
Well, you know, it's a mixed bag. In some cases, foreign aid did help stabilize countries and prevent them from falling under Soviet influence. But in other cases, backfired.
Okay, how so?
Well, the U.S. often supported regimes that were corrupt and authoritarian simply because they were anti-communist.
Wow.
And this created resentment.
Right.
It fueled instability. And in some cases, laid the groundwork for future conflicts.
It's a reminder.
It is.
That even the best intentions can have unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
Especially in a world as complex as the Cold War.
Yeah, it was a different time.
Yeah. And speaking of unintended consequences.
Okay.
Let's talk about the Suez Crisis.
All right. The Suez Crisis.
This event really shook up the global landscape.
It did.
And I think it forced Eisenhower to rethink his approach to the Middle East.
The Suez Crisis was a pivotal moment in Eisenhower's presidency. It demonstrated the limits of U.S. power and the complexities of navigating these Cold War alliances.
Right. So remind us what happened.
Okay, so just to quickly recap. In 1956, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, which was this vital waterway for international trade. Britain, France, and Israel, fearing Egypt's growing ties to the Soviet Union. They launched a military intervention to seize control of the canal.
So you've got these Western powers, traditional allies of the U.S., taking military action against a country that's just trying to assert its own sovereignty.
It's a mess.
Yeah, it's a tangled web.
It is.
How did Eisenhower respond to this?
Well, he was furious.
Really?
He felt betrayed by his allies for not consulting him beforehand. And he was worried that their actions would push Egypt further into the Soviet camp.
So what did he do?
Well, he did something pretty unexpected. He condemned the invasion.
Really?
And pressured Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw their forces.
That's a bold move.
It was.
Especially considering the Cold War context.
Right.
It seems like he was putting principle above real politics.
I think he was.
So why was he so adamant?
Well, I think he saw it as a matter of principle, but also as a strategic necessity. He believed that the U.S. had to stand up for the sovereignty of nations. Even if it meant going against its own allies. And he understood that supporting the invasion would alienate countries across the Middle East and undermine U.S. interests in the region.
So he was thinking about the long game.
The bigger picture. He wasn't just reacting to the immediate crisis.
It shows a level of strategic thinking.
I think so.
That I think is often missing in foreign policy. And this event led directly to the creation of the Eisenhower Doctrine, which basically formalized this U.S. commitment to containing Soviet influence in the Middle East.
The Middle East.
Right. We touched on this earlier.
We did.
But let's dig a little deeper. What exactly did the Eisenhower Doctrine entail?
Well, it went beyond just military force. It pledged economic and military aid to any Middle Eastern country threatened by communism. It was a way to try to win over hearts and minds to counter Soviet influence, not just through force, but through development and diplomacy.
So like a carrot and stick approach.
Exactly.
We'll help you develop your economy and defend yourself, but we're also ready to intervene militarily.
If necessary.
If necessary.
Right.
But didn't that also create a kind of dependency?
It did.
Like, weren't these countries relying,
to some extent,
on the U.S. for their security and their economic well-being? And didn't that create resentment?
It did.
And a perception of U.S. dominance?
You're raising really important points that continue to be debated today. The Eisenhower Doctrine, while it was intended to contain communism, it also entangled the U.S. in these complex regional conflicts and contributed to the perception of the U.S. as an imperial power.
It's a reminder that foreign policy
it's messy.
Is rarely simple.
No, it's
not. For these unintended consequences.
Yeah, and even the most well-intentioned actions can be perceived as meddling or interference.
It's all about perception.
It is.
And it highlights the challenges of navigating this world where power dynamics are constantly shifting and where the pursuit of national interests
often conflicts with these ideals of democracy and self-determination.
It's a lot to ponder.
It is a lot to think about.
So as we kind of reflect on Eisenhower's foreign policy, it's clear that he faced a lot of tough choices.
He did.
Often operating in the shadows.
A lot of things happening behind the scenes.
Making decisions that had far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely.
But amidst all the complexities of the Cold War, he also achieved some remarkable things.
He did.
I mean, he ended the Korean War.
He did.
He navigated the Suez Crisis. And laid the groundwork for future diplomatic efforts.
He was a complex figure trying to balance these competing demands of domestic politics, international alliances, and this rapidly changing world.
It was a time of Both great challenges and great opportunities.
Yeah.
It's a legacy that continues to shape our world
I think so.
today, for better or worse.
For better or worse.
Okay, so we've covered so much ground.
We have.
In this deep dive into the Eisenhower years.
It's a lot.
You know, from those iconic highways to the threat of nuclear war.
Yeah, a lot going on.
But as we wrap up,
okay.
I keep coming back to his farewell address.
It's a powerful speech.
It's almost eerie.
It is.
How relevant those warnings about the military-industrial complex feel even today.
It's really remarkable how much foresight he had.
And it's like he wasn't just saying goodbye.
Right.
He was giving us this cautionary tale.
Yeah, like a warning.
Yeah, a warning.
Be careful.
Yeah, be careful.
Be thoughtful.
Yeah, and that warning about the influence of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
It wasn't just some abstract fear.
No, he knew what he was talking about.
He knew what he was talking about.
He had firsthand experience.
Right. He wasn't some pacifist outsider.
Exactly.
The guy was a 5-star general.
Yeah. Supreme Commander.
Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces.
In World War II.
In World War II.
I mean, this is a guy who understands the power of the military.
So when he spoke about these dangers, it carried a lot of weight.
A lot of weight.
Yeah, and he'd seen the devastation of war.
Oh, yeah.
But he also understood the complexities of peacetime.
He knew that a strong military was essential, but he also saw how easily the pursuit of military power could kind of become an end in itself.
Right, and distort national priorities.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't just about the money.
No, it was about the influence.
The influence.
The influence that this complex could have.
Yeah, on decision-making.
On decisions, on public opinion, on everything.
Yeah, and pushing us towards conflicts.
Towards unnecessary conflicts.
Yeah, that maybe we didn't need to be in.
He called it unwarranted influence.
Oh, yeah.
Where the interests of the military and the defense industry became so intertwined with government that it was hard to separate them.
And then it just becomes this...
a vicious cycle.
Yeah, this self-perpetuating cycle.
Or you just keep needing more weapons, bigger budgets.
Yeah.
Not driven by actual security needs, but by the needs of this complex.
And he wasn't advocating for weakness.
No. He wasn't naive.
He understood the Cold War.
He understood the realities.
But he was calling for balance.
Yeah, and a more nuanced approach.
A recognition that true national security involved more than just military might.
More than just guns and bombs.
Right.
He believed that economic strength, diplomacy, the protection of individual liberties, these were all critical.
It makes you think about how we frame national security today.
It does.
Is it just about military spending?
Yeah.
And projecting power?
Projecting power.
Or is it about creating...
Or is it about something more?
A more just and equitable society?
Right.
That's resilient to both internal and external threats?
That's the big question.
So what can we learn from Eisenhower's warning?
I think a lot.
Yeah, how do we navigate this complex world?
It's so complicated.
Without falling into those traps?
I think it starts with awareness.
Okay.
We have to be conscious of the influence of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
We have to question the assumptions that drive military spending.
Yeah.
We have to demand transparency and accountability from our leaders.
And we have to broaden our understanding of national security.
It's more than just fighting wars.
Right. It's not just about fighting war.
It's about creating a world where everyone can thrive.
Right.
Where people's basic needs are met and where peace and justice prevail.
So it's about investing in things like diplomacy.
Absolutely.
Sustainable development.
Yes.
Yeah. The institutions that promote cooperation.
Cooperation is key.
And understanding.
Yes.
Recognizing that our security is interconnected.
We're all connected.
Yeah, we can't build walls high enough to keep out the problems of the world.
The world's too interconnected.
It really is.
And I think that's really the essence of Eisenhower's message.
Yeah.
It's a call to action.
It is.
It's a reminder that we have the power to shape the future.
Yeah.
To create a world that reflects our highest aspirations.
And not our deepest fears.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it.
I agree.
So thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into...
It's been my pleasure.
The Eisenhower years.
It's been fascinating.
Really a fascinating look.
He was a fascinating guy.
This often overlooked, but incredibly consequential in American history.
For sure.
And as always, thank you, the listener, for joining us.
Yes, thank you for listening.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.